Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us virtually today. We're excited to have renowned journalist and good friend of the Miller Center plus UVA grad John Dickerson with us to discuss his newest book, The Hardest Job in the World, The American Presidency. My dog-eared, multi-noted copy. It has been a real joy to dig into this work. And as I'll describe, we have had a front row seat in watching this book develop over time. John hardly needs an introduction, but he is a 60 Minutes correspondent and former host of CBS This Morning, anchor of Face the Nation, CBS News' chief Washington correspondent. If that weren't enough, John also writes for The Atlantic, co-hosts Slate's political Gabfest podcast, and hosts the Whistle Stop podcast. Given all that, it's a little intimidating to interview John, let me just say. But UVA proudly boasts John as one of our own most distinguished graduates. He generously gives his time and talent to the university for a number of programs. And he's played an exceedingly important role as an alumni of the Miller Center in some sense. He's been part of our Presidential Ideas Festival, where he was the honorary master of ceremonies. He moderated discussions. He was a panelist on at least 2 discussions. And he helped us design some of the key questions that we tried to ask. And his latest book was a big part of that, I think. I mean, I think at the time John was writing and researching his book, had some big questions in mind. As I said, we got a front row seat, and it is a tour de force. It spans the presidencies from Washington through Lincoln and FDR and Eisenhower, who will come back to Trump. And he makes the case for the American presidency being the toughest job in the world, and how to rethink the job, how to make it a little bit easier on the president and on us in a sense. So when I say we were along for the ride, we included John in a couple of workshops that we did over the last few years, including at presidential first years. We are 7 weeks away from Election Day. But given that John himself wants to break or at least change our expectations of how elections connect to the actual job of governing, I'm going to take John up on one of his recommendations, which is that we don't equate the candidate with the president. And we start thinking about the job from the day after the election. So first, John, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Bill. And that was a very lovely introduction. And I really am indebted to you and to the Miller Center, and I guess the university really for starting all of this many, many years ago.
Not just for introducing you to your wife, which maybe was the most important contribution.
Thank you. Yes, for rescuing me from that omission. Yeah. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here. As you were mentioning, that the Ideas Fest. Not only is there direct quotations from the work we did there that made their way into the book, but then after each day afterwards, I went to Alderman Library, which it's very difficult for me to see the recent pictures of it in its state of repair, or I guess renovation or demolition, whichever you wish. But I did 2 days of very solid work in that library the way I used to a long time ago. So there's a lot of UVA in this book.
Well, if you studied in the old stacks, if you studied in the new stacks, they're gone. Parts of the old stacks are still there, but hopefully we'll have a facelift that will be pleasing to you. But it's great to have you with us. Let's dig in, John. And we're going to focus on the transition. You write, the end depends on the beginning. As they build a team, savvy presidents recognize that governing and campaigning are 2 different things, and they require teams with different skills. So tell us about that. Tell us about the people and how they come together as a team building.
Well, where I first landed on this idea of team building and why it was so important is what I tried to do with the book was to take all of the reporting I'd done over the years and the disconnect I'd noticed between what people said they wanted in the office, which I covered in campaigns, and then what I covered in presidencies, which was a lot different the way things went down versus the way we talk about them in campaigns. And so I went back and tried to say, okay, what are the component parts of the job, what's necessary and what isn't? And in the course of those interviews, when I talked to CEOs or chiefs of staff or presidents or anybody who'd been involved in the presidency or studying it, the thing they put their finger on when I asked them, what's the first thing you would want to know about a president, is they said, I would want to know their capacity for building a team. Some people called it management. Some people said, who would they pick as their top person? But the obsession with how to build a team was important for me in a few ways. One, it mirrored what we see in the business world, where team building, ever since corporations started to change, where you no longer promoted from within, but it became a competition for skilled knowledge workers, the building of teams and the hiring of people became an obsession with any CEO. It's now the number one thing CEOs say they worry about, is how to build and maintain good personnel. And so in that way, it mirrors the presidency, and that's helpful because it means you've got a whole other body of knowledge that you can apply to the presidential process. That isn't always the case, and we can talk about that later. But it also changed my thinking in terms of thinking of the presidency more as an organizational leader than as just a president. Now, the minute you say that, you have to be very careful, because a leader doesn't always mean that they are, the chief operating officer. It needs to be more of the model that Tim Cook talks about at Apple when I interviewed him for the book. And he said that he thinks of himself more as a conductor, of an orchestra as a leader, which is to say somebody who has extremely talented people in those chairs playing first violin and the rest of it, but who then has a very important role making sure that they all work together. So team building is something that requires A, understanding what your objectives are, and then B, hiring for those objectives. The presidency is vastly different than in a campaign where you have one objective, winning, where all problems can come down to basically one thing, why I'm better than the person I'm running against. Governing, though, of course, you have many different objectives. You are not trying to convince people that you are better than the other person. You're trying to convince people that healthcare is the thing to care about at the moment, as opposed to the 10 other issues. And then healthcare, you should care about healthcare, and in this specific way. You have multiple constituencies. You've got the Congress to deal with, you've got the public to deal with, you've got your own agencies to deal with. So that's just a brief way in which the whole skill set for governing is very much different. And the people who carry all of that out is very much different than what you need for a campaign where, and this will be my last point, communications is a huge part of a campaign. It is an important part of the presidency, but a kind of a distracting one, where a lot of times presidents, and you know this so well, can diagnose a problem they can diagnose a problem as a communications failure when in fact it's an operational failure, a management failure, an execution failure. Mistaking what the diagnosis is can really cause trouble in a presidency.
You make this great connection on the people point in the book of saying that people are policy. And you point to some of the best people who have served presidents. You can name names if you want to, but give me a little sense of, from the staff up perspective, as the president's picking his team, what should he or she be looking for?
Well, and I'll give you my best shot of it, but there's so many experts at the Miller Center who have worked inside these administrations who would know exactly, the skill sets. But in a chief of staff, for example, I'll start with the big, most important position. Although I think, there could be a real interesting innovation between the chief of staff role and the vice presidential role, in terms of basically offloading some of the responsibility, not the accountability, but the responsibility for certain things on those big top positions. Anyway, the chief of staff, I think one of the most interesting things about the chief of staff is the ability to say no, both to the president and to all the people who want a piece of the president. And this is a lesson, of course, presidents have to keep learning over and over again, is the necessity and importance of the chief of staff, which is why Chris Whipple's book on chiefs of staff is such a great book, is that it gives you a sense of how those mistakes were sometimes repeated by presidents who, learned how important a chief of staff was and how important that, saying no to everybody was. Eisenhower basically saying that the chief of staff's job was to be the chief son of a bitch. And that's because the president's time is perhaps the most precious commodity in the entire organization. And then so that you just have to guard the president's time. You also have to guard the kind of information the president gets and make sure that it's both useful and that it's been cooked, that he's not getting and this is one of the big problems John Kelly had with President Trump, is running interference from a president who is highly improvisational and motivated by the latest piece of information he got. If he got bad information, that could lead to catastrophic results, or if not catastrophic, something it would take 2 or 3 days to unwind. So the chief of staff is a really crucial role. I think, interestingly, so then at your various agencies, one of the huge questions that I wrestled with, and I don't know what the answer is because it requires a multiple of changes, but when you put people at the head of these various departments, are you really going to let them be the head of their departments? Cabinet government was was very in vogue during the Carter years. And then Carter tried to run a cabinet government and learned that what happens is you end up getting blamed at the White House. So you can't outsource things to the cabinet. There are ways I think you can argue that you could. But until you change the delegation structure of a White House, that's a problem because you can't delegate if you're going to get blamed. That's why all kinds of decisions get brought into the White House. But if you can, the people you would put at the tops of those agencies would have you would make sure basically as president that they shared your values and your objectives. And then you would basically, what Warren Buffett said is you have to cultivate almost an air of indifference when you delegate at that level. And that requires a very thick political skin for a president. But I guess my point is a broad one about these other cabinet agency heads, which is you would basically say, okay, we agree on these fundamental values. And now you go do your job. And I will be one of the other things Tim Cook says is his job is basically to handle the noise. So he handles the noise so the people who do the work inside Apple can do their work. And that could be the president's model, which is you do what we agree you're going to do. You do it the way you think is best. I've put my trust in you, and I'll take the heat while you go carry out these things that we both believe in. That requires a huge political pain threshold, but it would be a fascinating experiment to see if it could work. And it would make, I think, for a better White House if you could ever really pull it off.
And a lot of trust. So, when you have a relationship like George H.W. Bush had with James Baker, you can give it out to your cabinet agencies if you really know and trust the people there. If you don't have that level of trust, it's harder to do.
Exactly right.
John, I mentioned Eisenhower before. It struck me, not just in reading the book, but going back through my notes, Eisenhower is a bit of not just a recurring figure, he's a hero. There's a typology at the very beginning of the book that you mentioned. Could you play that out for us? Because it runs throughout the book from the start to the finish, whether you're referring to people or legislative priorities or managing emergencies. It comes back time and time again.
I know, it was really one of the great things about writing is, and being on this this journey, which sounds like a sort of self-help expression, but in the process of trying to figure out what I thought about all of these questions at the center of the presidency is the Eisenhower surprise, which is, I had some views about Eisenhower, but one of the things that struck me about him that was very much in parallel with the work I was doing is that Eisenhower spent a lot of time in his journals and in public comments thinking about leadership, and not just what makes a good leader, points A, B, and C, but what makes a good leader in what instances, and how does a leader need to know how being the leader of a military operation is different than being the leader of a political party, is different than being a leader in a democratic government. And his capacity to understand that different leadership moments require different kinds of leadership, to me, seems to be a precondition for the job. One of the things that Secretary Leavitt says, who head of HHS under George W. Bush, is that, and Secretary Rubin said this, he said to me in the hallway of Cabell Hall when he was at the Ideas Fest, it was that you immediately basically have to drop everything you know about what you knew in order to engage in leadership in this new kind of way. Even if you've been in a leadership role before, you need to rethink it when you step into the leadership roles in government, and that's particularly true for a president. Eisenhower knew all that. What I seized on at the beginning was the Eisenhower quadrant system, which Eisenhower actually didn't have, but it's based on a comment attributed to him, which is that basically don't let the urgent crowd out the important. So anybody who has a job that requires drinking from a fire hose, which feels like anybody in modern life today, has to figure out how to sort priorities. And as Merlin Mann, who's a productivity expert, said, priorities are like arms. If you have more than two, you're either lying to yourself or you're delusional. You have to know what the priorities are for your presidency. And so the Eisenhower quadrant system essentially splits things into on an axis, and I don't want to confuse people, but basically you have things that are important and urgent, and then you have things that are not urgent, but that are important. And then the other categories, of course, are not urgent, not important, which is a really wasted time category. Although a lot of times we spend our time in campaigns and in Washington on things that are either urgent and not important or not urgent and not important. The key similarity between the two being that they're not important. But you would think of, when you think of something that is urgent and important, certainly, certainly every day, basically, COVID-19 is urgent and important. Every day before the first case was detected in the United States, COVID-19 was not urgent, but it was important. Climate change would be or combating the effects of climate change, I should say, are in the urgent and important category with respect to California. But mostly it's an issue that is not urgent in the sense that for a president, it's not something they have to react to in that moment, but it's certainly important. Eisenhower's, and here again, I'm back with Eisenhower. His famous speech about the military-industrial complex was something that he said, this is not urgent, you won't see it on your evening news, but if it continues, it will become urgent. So it is important, and apply some of your attention to it now. Why is this important for a president? Well, you're bombarded, and increasingly in the job, you are constantly bombarded by the press, your staff, your political supporters, all of whom want to put everything in the urgent category. So you have about 250 things at any moment that people think you should be paying attention to. And you have to learn how to basically get rid of 248 of them. And building a system that knows how to get rid of them and yet not forget them, in other words, hand them off, delegate them, in some cases ignore them. Managing that system is the precondition for being able to get your act together and get your job done. One of my favorite expressions of this recently was a quote from a disaster expert official who'd worked at FEMA in the New York Times, who said, a disaster is a terrible time to be exchanging business cards. And the point there was, you need to have developed relationships and considered things that were important before they become urgent. Because if you don't, by the time they're urgent, you can't be building the kinds of relationships, building the kinds of teams, doing the kinds of thinking that you need to handle problems that can only be handled if they've been given foresight and forethought. So the Eisenhower matrix and that approach to thinking about the presidency, and by the way, thinking about presidential coverage, I used to, when I first started thinking about this many years ago, used to take every event that happened in a campaign and say, okay, is this urgent and important, or is this basically urgent but not important? And then I would decide whether I wanted to talk about it or write about it. And so that really has been a durable and pretty useful way for me to think about a lot of the job and the way we cover the job.
So you mentioned the number 250 before. We're over that in the number of participants. And very important, not yet urgent, but please get your questions in. I'm going to ask John a few more questions, and we'll start turning to yours. So going to the urgency issue, there is so much put on, particularly if we have a new president after the election in November, if it's President Biden, not just to the transition, but the first 100 days. And you spend some time whacking at that pinata, John. Why?
Well, I had an instinct to whack at it because I've done a lot of the building of that pinata, or at least being a complicit in the building of the pinata, which is to measure presidents within their first 100 days, because my last interview with President Trump was at the 100-day mark, which is an arbitrary mark left over from FDR. And yet we use that number and the number of days as if it has some meaning when each presidency is quite different. And certainly all the presidencies since FDR have been different than his and during his first 100 days. So so it's a false frame, but also more important, I used it, or I whacked at that piñata because Michael Bloomberg said something that I really found nourishing in this investigation. It goes back to that team building. He said when he was mayor of New York, people said, "What'd you do in your first 100 days?" And he said, "I built my team." And he said nobody ever understood what he was talking about. And I found that nourishing because I'd done all these other interviews in which everybody said, you know, the most important thing is to build your team. And the most important thing is to find out whether the new president has a sense for the kind of team he wants and the structure and his theory of the case of how his team should work. So when I found that Bloomberg had said that, it was all kind of linking together very nicely. And what I like about that is, again, it's basically Bloomberg saying, I focused on the important in the first 100 days, not the urgent needs of my political supporters, not the urgent needs of the press who was sitting there tapping their toes while asking what I'd done within the first 100 days, but I set the conditions for my ability to both manage the things I wanted to do in his case, years as mayor, but as a president, the things I want to do on the normal timeline as president, but also, and this is crucial in this moment we're in, is that you need a team in place to have an operating tempo to handle surprises and disasters, because it turns out the job is a job of surprises and disasters, as you so well know. And then the fact that for me struck home so clearly on that was looking at the debates and the coverage in the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, which I covered and was a big part of. In the 3 debates between those two men, the word terrorism barely comes up. It's a passing tone. It comes up in a list of things that Al Gore says. You blink and you miss it. Well, it became the defining subject for the next 2 terms, the next 2 terms of the next president, George W. Bush. So a thing that you weren't expecting from all of your considered thought during the campaign, nevertheless consumes the next 8 years of American life. And one little interesting side note, it was the number 1 or number 2 issue in the 2016 election, according to Pew's polling, terrorism. It's not even in the top 5 now, right, which gives you an interesting sense of how fast things change. But anyway, that's one of the many presidential surprises that hit. And if you don't have a team in place, you won't be able to handle them.
So now, John, I want to circle back, particularly because that 100-day benchmark is often tagged to legislative accomplishments. There's, as I said at the outset, the book really is a tour de force, particularly the level of detail, and not just anecdote, but presidential history that it draws on. But one of the really deeper, profound lessons of the book is presidents are so much judged by their legislative accomplishments. And you make an argument that may be setting the benchmark too high. We see them as legislator in chief. But that is not just a challenge, but is a broken challenge because of the broken Congress. So help us unpack that a little bit, since the 100-day benchmark is so much based on FDR's passing a big legislative agenda, and then LBJ does it as well once he gets reelected. First, he does it in 1964 after the assassination, but when he gets reelected in 1964, his first year, 1965, he has a big legislative thing. Why should we not see the president as legislator in chief?
Well, I guess 2 things. One, my reading of FDR and the problem with studying all the presidents is you feel really on shaky ground when you go deep into one of them because there's so many experts that I drew on. Mm-hmm. But FDR, was obviously the legislative engine, and certainly relative to presidential expectation beforehand. But Congress was doing a lot of that work on its own. Congress was an active participant in American life and finding some of those solutions. And some of the scholarship I read, or a lot of the scholarship I read, was careful to say, we need to kind of recalibrate the way we think about what FDR did. Active, yes, more active in the legislative realm than previous presidents had been. But Congress was doing a lot of this work on itself, and therefore we need to dial back a little bit the idea of FDR as the legislative superhero. Again, his role was different and changed presidential expectations, where now Americans look to Washington for solutions, and they look to the big guy for solutions in a way they hadn't before. So not to take anything away from the crucial turning point of the Great Depression, the Second World War, and particularly with respect to solutions to everyday problems. But Congress was so much more alive than we see it today. And then, of course, LBJ's case, LBJ was another one, probably second to Eisenhower in just, I mean, the more that you learn about LBJ and the more fascinating both he is in all of his flaws, but also in his risk-taking and his legislative success, both in public and then also behind the scenes. It's just a marvel to watch him do the things he did. I think what's happened now, though, is obviously the political structure has changed in a way that has diminished Congress's role because it's less of an independent body, and we've seen that more, and we've seen that increasingly as the fortunes of individual members of Congress are tied to the fortunes of the president. The ability to separate oneself or is very difficult if the president is of your party, and the ability to agree if the president is of a different party has been shrunken. And so so we've got a situation where Congress is no longer a participant in the way they used to be, either an independent participant or someone who can carry the ball, and then it all basically comes out of the president. Now, Donald Trump is an interesting case because there's a lot that Congress is doing that he's not involved in because he's just not interested. And I'm kind of rolling around thinking, I mean, there are a number of people who think that actually Mitch McConnell rolls Donald Trump more than the other way around, because McConnell's just doing what he wants, and when he needs to, tending to the president's needs, but it basically is ignoring him a lot of the time. So we can kind of think that through. But at the end of the day, when the president doesn't have Congress to work with, the to-do list for the president gets longer. And then there are, of course, some things that the president can't do by himself. So we get these executive orders, as we saw the president trying to squeeze out some sort of thin executive orders to help continue with the relief during this pandemic when Congress failed to act. And those are not turning out to be very useful or effective. So it has this further distorting effect of people thinking that the president can do something when, in fact, we need Congress to be doing it if it's going to be of any use.
So, and we'll now start drawing questions from the audience. I will say on this one, the person who asked the question has my last name, is a first year at UVA. And Annika asked, do you think the Trump presidency has blurred the lines between the campaign and the office, that is using the White House for the RNC convention, using his own money to fund the election? John, I thought that's an interesting way to bridge back where I didn't want to go at the beginning, which is elections are not how we should judge the president. We should judge them. But yet we do see a blurring and a constant. President Trump announced his reelection the day after he was inaugurated, his reelection campaign. So talk a little bit about that.
Yes, we see so many blurrings, and one is part of a trend. One is some special and particular things that the president has brought. I spent some time thinking about George Herbert Walker Bush because George Herbert Walker Bush's campaign in 1988 against Michael Dukakis was considered until the 2016 campaign the kind of ugliest we'd had in the modern age. The campaigns, in the 19th century and even in the 20th century, there were some pretty grim and ugly ones. But 1988 was pretty bad. They tore down Michael Dukakis using every trick in the book. And yet, when he came to office, President Bush recognized a distinction between what you do to gain power, which is what campaigns are, acquiring the power necessary to then go do the things you want to do. He recognized a set of norms that operated in the presidency. And so we have James Baker getting a suggestion from Republicans in the House that they use Russian information against Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton went and visited Russia as a college student. And Baker said, no, absolutely not. There's also Baker did a similar thing when he worked for Gerald Ford. He would write memos to the file to basically codify all the bad ideas he shot down in case they ever popped up again. Because he had this sense of things that you just could and should not do as president. They stepped over a line, even if it was in the furtherance of maintaining power by getting reelected. And so George Herbert Walker Bush did that a couple of different times in different ways. Also, when he made the budget deal that he did and went back on his no new taxes pledge, he made a governing choice. He said, yes, I said this in the campaign and in the heat of the campaign. And in retrospect, he told John Meachin, his biographer, it was kind of pulled out of me in the heat of the moment, and everybody loved it in the convention in Houston. But it did cause me trouble as a president. And yet he chose to do what he thought in the case was the governing thing, the right thing. Why did I spend so much time on that? Because President Trump has basically gotten rid of that line. He uses the campaign tactics to win in campaign, which for him were amazing, beating all the professional politicians he did, and he's just moved them into the White House. And that includes using Ukraine policy, that includes using the office of the White House, that includes using the White House grounds in the convention. And the reason this matters is it's not only the furthest kind of leap of a trend, but of course, when you go back to the founders, the one thing they worried about was that the personal ambitions of the president would leap the responsibility the president felt to the system and to public duty. And that's why it matters when the president uses the White House grounds. It's not just something called the Hatch Act, but it's this erosion of what should be a wall between personal self-interest and the public good. And the founders had hoped that a president of virtue would resist the obvious temptation to use the powers of office for their personal aggrandizement, and that was kind of a precondition for the job. That's all, of course, gone by the wayside.
So to that point, Lauren Hershey writes and asks, do you see any good reason to change the tenure of the presidency from 4-year term renewable to a single 6-year term, or some alternative configuration?
Well, I like those ideas to think them through. I don't know if that gets, obviously the problem with the 1 6-year term is that, at the end, 2 years at the end of it, it becomes a presidential campaign that the president's not involved in. And so they lose some of their political power.
And accountability.
And accountability. I think, ambition, of course, one of the things, again, when I went back to try to break this down to its building blocks and look at the original blueprint of the office, ambition was both a cancer, as the founders thought of it, but it was also crucial and also necessary. The civic road to glory was an important thing for a president to have, or the civic was an important thing for the president to travel and want to travel, was to reach glory through their public acts. So you needed ambition, absolutely. You just also needed to know when to use it for the country's ends and not your own personal ends. And so the ambition embedded in a second term, which I think it was Gouverneur Morris who said, you have to have a second term because you need to provide an outlet for this ambition. Because if you don't provide the outlet, a president might say once in office, I'm going to use the powers of my office to keep myself in office. So, but you need to hook your ambition to the public good, and that's when we get the greatest achievements in America from presidents, is that when they get that balance right, when they use their ambition. So I think the benefit of a second term is their ambition gets involved. And so they want to have a second term. So and if the system's set up right, they win the second term by doing the most good for the country. The problem is in our current partisan situation, you have incentives that encourage you to do the best for your party, which is very different than doing the best for the country.
So that tees up a great question from Sandra Anderson, who asks, has the president gradually taken over too much authority, or has Congress relinquished it? Madison talks about countering ambition with ambition. Ambition is not necessarily seen as that which an angel has, and if all men were angels, we wouldn't need government. But the idea was that Congress was going to also be ambitious, and powers wouldn't just be separated; they'd be shared. So if they did something together, they could accomplish something.
Right, and that was the necessary kind of. It was like a clock. You needed the springs of the clock to be grinding against each other to give it motion. So you needed both. And the problem with where Congress is today is that it's not pushing back against the presidency in the way that creates that important tension. And one of the ways that I thought about this in the most healthy way that I think about this is in terms of, in terms of military action. Obviously, that's pretty much been ceded over to the presidency, and for good reason. That was embedded in the original creation of the office. You need to have somebody who can act quickly and with energy to protect the nation. So we get that. But on long-term and big engagements of U.S. forces, the benefit of having a Congress that weighs in, as well as a president, is the president's incentives are quick and urgent and solve this problem now. The members of Congress represent the whole country. And so, they represent the people they represent constituents who've been fighting wars for the last 18 years of American life, or whose children have been fighting those wars. And they have a different view, more mellow, perhaps, more seasoned, more whatever, but a view that is informed by 18 years of warfare across the whole country from which we draw our military service. And that's an important part of the conversation. The conversation shouldn't be dominated just by the chief executive, who has a set of obligations to keep the country safe and quickly react. It isn't to say military force or not, but to have them both engaged in making those decisions is important when you're talking about a diverse country with diverse points of view. So Congress has a lot of these, powers have ceded to the president, and again, it also, even if you weren't getting solutions in Congress, when you talk to members of the Senate in particular, they all say, at least in interviews I've done, just let us vote. What happens is that the political necessity of managing votes means that they don't even get to weigh in a serious way on a lot of issues of the day, because votes don't happen unless they sort of work politically in the moment, which means we even lack the proper debate to kind of kick up some of these ideas. Yes, we have endless pundits who happen to run for office and then go back on cable and talk about things, but talking about things is different than actually having to cast a vote. And that's just one small way in which Congress doesn't even participate in a meaningful way in some of these debates, because they don't take votes and therefore aren't really putting, to use a cliche, their skin in the game.
John, the word temperament comes up at several points in the book. You address it early on, you come back to it toward the end. There are a bunch of questions in here about the distinction between leadership and management. So let's take it in a couple of different directions. One, in leadership in terms of projecting a set of values, projecting a set of priorities, but also in sustaining a team. One of the questions in here is what president sustains a team, and how do they do it well, and how does that relate to temperament? So talk a little bit about temperament in both senses.
Yeah, I think temperament, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about temperament and character, in part because Donald Trump excites those questions and engages, gives them to us every day. We've never had a president who the EKG of his id is a part of our daily conversation, which is the president's Twitter feed. I mean, you can tell what the president's passions are, for better or worse, in the moment because of what he's tweeting about. And you also get a sense of his operating tempo. And one of the things we've learned, and that everybody who works with him testifies to, some as a positive, some as a negative, is that what you see is on the outside is what you see and is what is happening on the inside. And so for me, temperament means basically in a job where you're being pelted all the time, you need to have the equanimity to basically blow a lot of it off, need to have the equanimity to accept the criticism from the persons you trust who are coming to you telling you things you don't want to hear. And boy, is that a hard thing to do, because it's just psychologically wearying. Just those two things, to both be able to ignore some of the criticism. Barack Obama had a device he used where he basically thought of Barack Obama, the president, as some character disconnected from himself, because so often when you're president, you hear pundits and even supporters making all kinds of claims about what you're thinking that have nothing to do remotely with what you're thinking. He wandered by a television in the White House at one point and saw somebody saying, explaining his thinking, and he said out loud, perhaps to no one in particular, "Oh, that's what I was thinking." Because it's just not. So you have to have that kind of equanimity to just deal with the pelting of the day to day. But you also need to have, at this point, I go to James Wilson, the conservative political scientist's definition of character, which was both, had two parts, empathy and self-control. The self-control part goes back to Eisenhower and his matrix, the ability to sublimate your instantaneous needs and desires for longer term thinking, and to be able to consider things outside of your immediate appetites. Whether those appetites are inflamed by your just own personal energies or by whatever the disaster of the moment is. Second part was empathy, and that empathy goes to me a little bit back to temperament too, because it requires a certain subtlety of character, subtlety of personality, and that empathy is essentially meaningfully taking into account the views and thoughts of people who are not in your tribe, which is to say, not in your political base. And I think the protests surrounding the George Floyd's murder are a good way to think about this, which is that when I did interviews surrounding that, I would basically ask politicians, what do you hear in what the protesters are saying? And it was very interesting, those politicians who heard pain and anguish from the American system that was not giving Black Americans an equal shot. And then those who heard something very different and more adversarial. If you cannot hearing what the protests are saying does not mean embracing policies that any of the protesters might like. But hearing it is a first job, at least, of a president, and that requires empathy. Because in this case, you have a president who the protesters are not in his political base. And so that could be true for a president, any kind of president. But those character and temperament, to me, are what I've been thinking a lot about, because at the end of the day, A, they're hard to measure in a campaign, and B, they are the guiding soul and stuff of a presidency, which can sometimes make all the difference in some of these big, high-stakes moments. Final point is this: if the character and temperament of the president is can inspire the rest of the administration, even without having a conversation. If they model certain kinds of behavior, everybody who works for them knows what the boss wants because they can intuit it. It doesn't have to be written down. It doesn't have to be in a campaign pledge. They just know that this is the kind of thing that the boss is going to care about, and I'm going to go work all night long to make sure it gets fixed. And that is an important organizational benefit of character and temperament.
So Isabella Sheridan asks, when a president has a great deal of turnover in their team, is that a sign of a leader trying to create the best team possible? Or is it an indicator of a bad leader losing qualified people, or could it be both?
It could be both if it happened at a rate that was sufficient for the task. So what does that mean? If you're spinning people out of your organization at such a rate that you can never evaluate them, or couldn't possibly have taken the time to evaluate them, and in doing so, change your opinion of them from they hang the moon and stars to they were totally unfit for the job, that shows that's incompatible with the kind of leadership we're talking about here. And that's basically been what President Trump has done. He has, and this is just, these are the facts. The Brookings Institution looked at the turnover, and he has had faster and more turnover and more in the sort of A-level positions than any presidency.
It was Katie Tempest, by the way, who's just joined us as a senior fellow and also a UVA grad, did that study. Yeah.
Oh, well, excellent. And that's important, because that's the distinction we're talking about here is this churn to just creating more froth? One of the things that I spent so much time, and I wonder what the numbers are now. It was that in the first 3 years that Trump, and this is that Brookings study, lost 82% of his A-team White House staffers. And what I learned in looking at the presidency and the transition, and also the first period of time, is that, and we talked about this at the Ideas Fest, is it takes a long time to get up to speed. There is no organizational chart that you kind of all slot into. Everybody kind of finds their place. And it takes a long time to get working as a team. And if the firings are happening faster than you can get together and work as a team, you are not building a basis on which to evaluate a person's skills within that team.
Especially when an emergency or something hits. One of our questions is, how can presidencies and state long-term plan for issues that are important but not urgent in a way that survive to the next administration? So if you've got urgent things coming, your team's not in place, you're not responding well, you're also not planning for and pulling the team together for the big things that last.
Right, exactly. I mean, I wrote a piece when the book came out for The Atlantic, and the lead of the piece was that Donald Trump should have seen the pandemic coming, not because the Obama administration had left a 92-page playbook, not because George W. Bush had created a pandemic task force during his presidency, all of which is true, but because the president should see big surprises coming because they come. And in order to prepare for those big surprises, you cannot have serial turnover. You need to build a team, and you need to plan your team. I mean, I think you could make the case, and I'm on a limb here, but I think you could do the work and make a case that serial turnover is antithetical to the kind of team building you need. In other words, obviously you don't want to have subpar people in your administration, which is why the transitions are so important. The transition in the Trump team, they basically took all the work that Governor Christie had done in building a transition roster of people to choose from, and they basically threw it all out. And they built their team in a kind of higgledy-piggledy way, which put them in already behind the 8 ball in terms of being able to administer the White House. But I think you should, I think team building and thinking about your administration should be, and I think this is the case with the Biden campaign, something that you think about well now. I mean, Jimmy Carter was thinking about it before he even got the nomination, which is funny because, of course, people think of, and rightfully so, the difficulty managing his White House that he had. But and I don't want to go on too long, but having a team in place that can operate is crucial. It's a national security issue, really, because the surprise is coming. And so you have to have a team that's at least sufficiently competent and doesn't have serial turnover to be able to handle those surprises.
So having discussed both leadership and management, a question comes up from time to time. And in this case, Maya Amagami, who is one of our governing council members, asked, should we just do what a lot of other countries do, which is have a president to do the ceremonial stuff and have a prime minister really do the legislative things?
This is Walter Lippmann wrote a piece basically arguing this when Eisenhower had his heart attack. Hoover, in either his first or second reorganization, basically argued for another vice president who would take this role, which I never quite got to the bottom of, which was, what about the existing vice president? He sort of jumped over whatever the existing vice president's duties were and suggested creating another one. Anyway, I think that, and a lot of people have mentioned that, I think it's an interesting idea. The problem is that a president gets a lot of their ability to do things because of their political power within their party and the ceremonial roles and the ceremonial gifts they can bestow. And while the celebrity nature of the presidency is a mess in a number of different ways, and it was Sid Milkis actually who I can't remember his great quote about this, but that first introduced me to the dangers of the celebrity nature of our president and trying to have one person represent an entire great big country. But as bad as that is, it is powerful and useful in getting people to move and getting kind of the propulsive force of the celebrity nature of the job and the ceremonial nature of the job actually has governing benefits. If you split the two apart, you would probably lose some of that. Now, I haven't kind of thought this all the way through. You would require kinds of other, like how and where would you make the separations? And because if you make them too ceremonial for the sort of kingly president, then basically everybody will ignore them and they'll just listen to what the regular president does. And the regular president would have to spend, or the president who does the work, would have to spend all of his or her time not talking because everything they said would be given weight because they're the ones responsible for getting things done. So it would almost, it feels like you would essentially have a president who had 95% of the power and then a sort of 5% figurehead president that just pardoned turkeys and, went to throw the opening pitch at Little League games.
John, we've got about just less than 10 minutes left. So I'm going to sort of cluster up a couple questions here and have you do, people love to ask the question, you and I talked about this, and I know your own instincts about this, which is not to pick your favorites, not to rank the presidents, but people touch on a number of different parts of the job. So I'm wondering if you could talk about presidents who have done different things well. So there's questions about the president and the Justice Department and how much the Justice Department should be an extension of the presidency. Who has managed that relationship well and who's managed it poorly?
Manage the relationship between
the presidency and the Justice Department. How independent should a Justice Department be? How much should the president be, the administrator-in-chief of the laws of the country?
Well, I think I can think of other areas where presidents have managed their presidencies well. I don't think I can do that on the Justice Department. I mean, obviously the general rule of separation between the two is the best practices for all the reasons we have familiarity with in the current moment and also in previous presidencies. And as we get into, so the wall should exist. I don't know who's maintained that wall, because the minute I name a president who's maintained that wall well, I'll leave out some, crucial mistake.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to stump you with it. I was struck in the book in how you remind us that Barack Obama referred to Eric Holder as his wingman. And Bill Clinton really struggled with Janet Reno, and then also struggled with Louis Freeh at the FBI. It's almost as if every president struggles with having DOJ be too independent. And yet, on the one hand, on the other hand, in this presidency, the criticism, everybody expected Bill Barr to be the Bill Barr that he had been in the Bush 41 administration. And yet he seems so closely connected to the president as to not have fulfilled people's expectations there.
Well, right. And you also get slop over in the sense that you have Bill Barr commenting about people playing with fire with when they have mail-in ballots. So he said, that they're playing with fire. I think that's essentially echoing the president's argument about the dangers of mail-in balloting, and then echoing what the next day the Department of Homeland Security said was the chief narrative the Russians were pushing, which is that the mail-in ballot system is a catastrophe to sow chaos in the American system. I think you want to not be involved in any of that if you're the Attorney General, based on my understanding of the relationship with the job. And so when he's straying into just regular old like punditry, that seems to me to be dangerous. I think some of the presidents who have done well, some of the things that I found wise in, everybody talks about the team of rivals with Lincoln, but when Reagan picked James Baker, who had been his rival, not just with Bush, but also running Ford's operation in 1976 against Reagan, which, arguably, it denied Reagan the nomination. He had every reason not to pick Baker, who was considered not one of the movement conservatives that were going to change everything with this new revolutionary victory. And yet Reagan was smart enough to know what he didn't know about Washington and hire somebody who could manage Washington.
As his chief of staff. Yeah.
As his chief of staff. And that also represents a different understanding of what success looked like in Washington. In other words, he was coming to revolutionize Washington, but he realized that he would have to make his revolution go through legislation and actual achievement in Washington. He wasn't just going to burn it down. He was going to achieve things, and he needed somebody as his chief of staff who could get things done in Washington. So that to me seems like the kind of forward-thinking, long-term thinking, smart team building that seems very smart. I think Obama in a lot of his choices at various different positions, and in his constant and his staff's constant attempt to keep the urgent and the important in proper perspective was, I remember Dennis McDonough, his chief of staff, talking about during the total catastrophe of healthcare.gov, saying basically we have to spend, I can't remember what his exact percentages were, but we spend 20% on dealing with healthcare.gov. And that's our most, that's a pressing concern. But there is still 80% of our job that is important. And that is, the world still spins, and there are all these other things that we have to pay attention to. Whether they were successful in doing that or not, the focus on the big picture, even in a moment when everybody's screaming about the smaller picture, is a habit worth cultivating in any White House. And then I think there are some presidents who tried to do really interesting and innovative things. Carter is one of them, both in the way he tried to cabinet government, and you can see the ways it was doomed to fail from the start, but it was interesting and really worth trying again. But then also his attempt to build a governing team, which again also failed, but build a governing team before he'd even won the nomination, which then got into a predictable clash between his governing team and the campaigning team. Those on the campaigning team saying basically, "Hey, we got you here. Why are you going to cut us out right at the moment when we can go to Washington and govern?" Nevertheless, Carter was kind of right in designing it that way, because a lot of your people with campaign skills lack the skills for government.
Yep. So we've just got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to ask this question, but then I'm going to give you a little bit more freedom in answering. What is the best preparation resume for a president? Business, government, at a national or state level, military, or the public arena, media, entertainment? Rather than ask it that way, or maybe alternative to that is, who has used their background and training best in the presidency? Or who has used it well? And who has supplemented well that which they didn't know? You do this great job of comparing LBJ and Obama as having very completely different skill set. LBJ, the master legislator, Obama having almost no legislative background, but he had his own set of skills and things that he brought to the table. Who used their background well, and who knew what they didn't know and supplemented it well?
I think at the end of the day, so that's really interesting, because you can argue, if you listen to Mitch McConnell's description of Joe Biden, basically Obama should have outsourced legislative affairs to Joe Biden from the first day. Mm-hmm. And ultimately in some big cases, he did outsource it, because Biden knew how to operate in the messiness of the Senate, and just make progress in a way that President Obama had not served long enough in the Senate to get anything done. And so I'm not sure that that would be seen as a success, but it was an instinct he had, and that worked in some instances, and that probably is a model for. It's just no president wants to give up that much control, although President Trump has not really inserted himself in any negotiations really in any meaningful way with Congress.
And that's probably, as you were saying before, that's probably helped him.
It's probably helped him, yeah. I mean, so I think it's clear that George Herbert Walker Bush's experience in public service and deep interest in foreign policy gave him the fingertip feel to handle the collapse of communism. Restraint is a quality of presidents that I tried to figure out, because we spend so much time thinking of the presidency as an action hero office, where the presidency comes in and does aggressive and active things and solves and comes up with some big solution, which doesn't happen very often. And this is why LBJ is so interesting and so complicated, because he did do that in a lot of ways legislatively. It was his force of personality, understanding of the way the game worked, ability to work Congress in a way that you could never do today. And he had the momentum of John Kennedy's death to, turn his program into a martyr's cause. So he had special skills that he used in a special circumstance. Although I think you could spend some time figuring out. I mean, LBJ used special skills in a special circumstance, but still took amazing risks. And that ability to take risks at the right time is, of course, crucial to the job. But George Herbert Walker Bush had the training and the understanding to know that it was not a smart idea to spike the football when the wall came down in Germany. And that training, that wasn't so much outsourcing something that he didn't know, but it was something he knew from his training that was wise. One of the things that I wonder about the Trump administration is whether he essentially outsourced a lot of the military operations in a way that at the very end of this, 20 years from now, we might actually find that despite the very negative things he said to the military to their face, and he said out loud, and that he said about people like John McCain, that in fact, he let the military do what it needed to do to finish the job against ISIS. Now, Brett McGurk, who worked for President Bush, President Trump, and President Obama, has a very, very negative view of the president's handling of national security when it comes to defeating ISIS, and certainly Secretary of Defense Mattis does as well. So I don't want to go too far out on a limb here, but basically letting the warfighters do their job may, in the end, be something that that President Trump, either through design or just disinterest, that ended up getting a lot of work done that basically being as successful against ISIS as the military has been. So that's a kind of outsourcing. That's a provisional question, but it'll be interesting to look at. So I think, unless I get another blast of insight, I think I'll end my answer there.
Well, John, thank you. Thanks for spending an hour with us. Thanks for all of your friendship and partnership and participation in our events over time. And thank you for this book. It really is terrific. Highly recommend this to everybody. The Hardest Job in the World, the American Presidency, particularly whether we're looking at a first Biden administration or a second Trump term. There's so much education in here, not just for the president and all his men and women, but also for all of us. And so, John, thank you for everything you do.
Thank you so much, Bill. I really appreciate it. It was fun.